All right, so I do have a PowerPoint, so hopefully that'll come up. If I need to do something here, let me know, Jared. It's a blessing to be here. It's a blessing to worship together. Sunday mornings are such an encouragement to me, to my life, and just worshiping together collectively. You know, we can worship together, or we can worship in our homes, and we should, but there's nothing quite like worshiping together. Well, looks like we're backwards here. I'll let the tech guys, Josiah, you want to check this? Anyway, so it's been a blessing to be here this morning and to just praise God together. I appreciate so much the devotional and the time of worship, and also our Sunday school time, and the encouragement we receive by getting into small groups and sharing together. What a blessing. The message this morning I've entitled Paradoxes of the Kingdom. Now, the word paradox simply means this is in my own words, but when the result of the action doesn't line up with what we think it should, when what we do, the consequence of what we do is different from what we think it should be. It's a paradox. And there's quite a few of those in Jesus' teaching that in our minds they don't quite line up, they don't quite make sense. And so I call it a paradox. And so I'm curious this morning which ones you can think of. I'll give you a hint. So first one that came to my mind, or that comes to my mind, is the first shall be last. So what are some paradoxes that you think about in or that, there we go, back up here. But yeah, just open it up. What are some paradoxes that you think about that come to your mind? What are things that don't make sense that Jesus taught, or maybe it's in Scripture in general? Love those that hate you. Yes. Die to live. It's an absurd or a self-contradictory statement, or a proposition that when investigated or explained may prove to be well-founded or true. Any more? Yes. Give up everything to be rich. The greatest shall be called the least. The list goes on. I am going to be preaching some from the Beatitudes from Luke's perspective this morning. And that's a list that just rattles off one after the next. And so we'll be looking at some of those in a little bit here. But there are so many. And it's so much so that there's books. I think of the one, David Brousseau wrote the book, The Kingdom That Turned the World Upside Down. Things are opposite from what they seem. But as I was thinking about this, I was like, you know what? But there's plenty of this within the kingdom of this world as well. And it's the opposite. The kingdom of this world wants you to believe that the result of this will be that. And usually it's not. And the list could go on and on. Think of different things that we are tempted into, whether it's alcohol or drugs. The promise that this will make your life better, and it's actually the opposite. It makes your life miserable. Yeah, there may be a little bit of an emotion or a high that goes with the say, drugs, for example, but the net result is misery. Completely opposite. You drive down the road, you see the billboards, and what they're advertising, and a lot of times it's the same way. When you stop and think about the logical conclusion of what is being advertised, the net result is misery. And so, paradoxes of the kingdom this morning is the kingdom of Jesus, but be aware, this is also true in the kingdom of darkness, but it has a false side to it. So I'm going to be sharing from the Gospel of Luke, and I've been reading through Luke some the last little bit, and just was interested in who Luke was as a person and the writings that he had. So I'm going to share just a little bit of a backdrop to the Gospel of Luke and look at some of the chapters leading up to Luke chapter 6, and we're going to look at the verses 20 to 26 as a message this morning. But Luke is an interesting character. He was born probably about the same time Jesus was. We don't know for sure, but it would appear like he was about the same age as, or about the same time frame. So very likely grew up not necessarily with Jesus, but grew up in the same era, grew up in the same time frame. He was a co-laborer with Paul. He was it's probably one of the only, we're not certain about all the writers of the New Testament, but he is probably one of the only ones that was not of Jewish descent. So he was a Gentile. He was not a disciple of Christ like some of the other writers of the Gospels were. Like I said, he was a co-laborer with Paul, and Paul called him the beloved physician. Some think he was never married, a lot like Paul. But it's possible that Luke and Paul studied together, and that's where they could have possibly gotten to know each other. This is all conjecture. We don't know for sure about that. But Paul did call him the beloved physician in Colossians 4:14. And so we know that he was a physician. And when you think about a physician, that's a bit interesting. Some of you think of your family doctor, and I think that would be about as close as you get to a physician. Although a physician in this era of time was probably a little bit of a broader sense. Doctors today seems like they are very much focused on one thing, medicine a lot of times. But a physician in this era was a mix of a healer, a herbalist, and a philosopher. And so when I think about those three coming together, I think that's kind of fascinating, because wouldn't it be interesting if doctors would actually know all of that and be able to, put some, philosopher type of stuff into there and be able to connect the things? Because isn't it often true that what affects us spiritually also affects us physically? And so a physician in that time was more that type of a person. We already talked about the time that he grew up in, but this book was probably written in about the year AD 60. Luke also wrote the book of Acts. And so when you combine the book of Acts and the book of Luke, it's more content than even what Paul wrote. So that's a fascinating little tidbit there. Luke was a man of prayer. He wrote more about prayer than any of the other Gospels. 3 of the parables that he cited were about prayer, or making parables on prayer. He dedicated his books, both of them, both Luke and Acts, to Theophilus. We don't know much about Theophilus, but very likely he was a convert of Luke, and it would appear like maybe he was a man of influence, maybe he was a pastor. We don't know for sure, but he certainly was respected. And so Luke now was moved by God, I believe, to write down the story of Jesus, and then also go into Acts and write down this story. And if you think about it, if this was written in AD 60, and Jesus died in AD 30, this would have been about 30 years after the dramatic events of the New Testament, where Jesus died and rose again, and the 3-year period that Jesus was on this, or he was in his ministry. And so 30 years after that, and I was thinking about that time frame a bit this morning. So if you're 30 years old, or say you're 40 or 50, how many of you can remember back to what happened 30 years ago? Some of you that are in your 70s and 80s, not a big problem. The big things in life you remember. But if you're only 20 or 30 here this morning, what happened 30 years ago really is not front and center in your mind. So if you're 30 years old this morning, I wonder what you remember about 9/11. Probably not that much. If you're 20 years old, even less. And 15 and younger, almost, it's history book stuff. And so here we have a young church, 30 years old, but 30 years away from the events that happened that changed so much in the world. And it was necessary that these things are recorded. And so that's what Luke did. He wrote this down, both Luke and Acts. He says in Luke chapter 1, verse 1, "Inasmuch as many have taken in hand to set in order a narrative of those things which have been fulfilled among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. So he says, I'm going to set in order a narrative, or I'm going to tell the story how it was. He says, I'm going to write an orderly account. And I think in a sense he wanted to clarify the story. There was probably different stories beginning to come out, different versions of this. And so Luke, as a man that had been there in a sense, says it's going to take it into, or make it his job to write this story. And I just find it fascinating that God used a man, a physician, a man that had studied, a man that had been and he knew how to put things together. He knew how to make a case for the story, and so he did that. He did that well. He used Luke to do that. And so the idea of writing it into an orderly account is kind of the idea that he's going to write it in a sequential order, or as it happened. And so Luke does that more than some of the others would. And so let's just look at a few of these chapters before we get into the message this morning. So the first two chapters of Luke are about the birth of Jesus. Very well written. Gives us probably the best overall view of the history surrounding the birth of Jesus. Lots of detail there, different views from different people. Luke chapter 3 talks about John the Baptist and how he prepares the way. And again, the story is well written. It's given the perspective of other people and how they played into this era of time. And then the last part is the genealogy of Jesus. Luke saw it important that he connects all this together. Luke chapter 4 then is the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but first of all, the temptation in the wilderness, and then how Jesus began his ministry in Galilee and Nazareth. We have several verses there that talk about this. In 4:22, it says, "So all bore witness to him and marveled at the gracious words which proceeded out of his mouth. And they said, 'Is this not Joseph's son?'" So Jesus began his ministry, but these people kind of knew who he was. He was in their town. They had seen him grow up. And so they were questioning this because Jesus would go into the synagogues even up until before this time. And he had slowly started his ministry. And so now the miracles and some words that they struggled with. In verse 23, he said to them, "You will surely say this proverb to me, 'Physician, heal yourself. Whatever we have heard done in Capernaum, do also here in your country.' Then he said, 'Surely I say to you, no prophet is accepted in his own country.'" So he wasn't too well accepted here. They didn't quite want to believe this person that they knew was Joseph's son and had grown up with. And so Jesus moved on from there. In chapter 5, Jesus' popularity grows. Jesus calls fishermen to be his disciples after engaging them in their trade. So he sat in the boat to teach the people. I don't think Jesus was a fisherman, but he was in the boat, and the disciples these two disciples, I think it was Peter and John, had been out fishing, and they couldn't catch any fish. And Jesus said, "Put the net on the other side. You have the miracle of the fishes." And they were amazed. And so Jesus engaged them in their trade and then told them that from here on you would be followers of me. And he did the same thing with Levi, or Matthew. It's kind of an interchangeable name, but Matthew was a tax collector. So Jesus went to his house. He engaged Matthew in his profession. See that in Luke chapter 5. And they invited the people in. They invited Matthew. Matthew invited his friends in, and Jesus sat with them there and engaged him. And then he called him to be his disciple as well. And then he begins, in verse 36, he begins teaching in parables. And we have a lot of this. And so this is going to get into the message just a bit more a little later about how Jesus taught in parables. And sometimes it's very clear what he's trying to say in the parable, and other times it's not so clear. In chapter 6 then, getting close to where Jesus had the Sermon on the Mount, where we're going to focus this morning. But the first part of chapter 6, Jesus had this big conflict with the Pharisees around the Sabbath. And this is a reoccurring thing. It kept coming up again and again, how Jesus and what he did on the Sabbath. And here in particular, they were talking about whether it was okay for Jesus and his disciples to go through the field and eat some corn along the way. And so the Pharisees had come up with a whole list of do's and don'ts, things that they added to the Levitical law about what they could and could not do. And so apparently they had quite a few laws around the Sabbath. And Jesus, he, in a sense, just, it was a point of conflict, but he gave them his opinion and told them how it should be. Jesus brings clarity to what really matters. And he said, the Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. It's kind of actually a hard saying for me. I'd like to know more about this. But Jesus had authority to do that. And occasionally, he would point to that authority. The other thing that they kept fighting him about was when he would heal people on the Sabbath. And so Jesus would ask, well, is it okay to do good or not to do good on the Sabbath? And they didn't know what to do. So in a sense, this was a point of conflict that kept coming up, and it was something that kept pushing them in the wrong direction. In chapter 6, verse 12 to 16, Luke identifies the 12 apostles and just names them there. I thought that was interesting. Again, from the perspective of a physician, he was putting things in order. He was making a case for what Jesus, who he was. And I appreciate that. The last thing in this part, before we get into the sermon, was this. And I don't think I ever noticed this quite like I did this time. And I'm going to read it. Luke chapter 6, verse 17 to 19. If you've been following along, you can continue to do so, but I'm in Luke chapter 6. You can find it in your Bibles. But in verse 17, and again, this is very early on in Jesus' ministry. His popularity has waxed and waned a bit. In some of the towns, not so much. In other towns, very much. And here's one of the reasons why. It says in verse 17, he came down with them and stood in the plain, and the company of his disciples, and a great multitude of people out of all Judea and Jerusalem, and from the seacoast of Tyre and Sidon, which came to hear him, and to be healed of their diseases. And they were vexed with unclean spirits, and they were healed. And the whole multitude sought to touch him, for there went virtue out of him, and healed them all. It says he healed them all. So they were thronging him, they were coming to him, and just wanting to touch him. And I just get this picture that the people were there with their aches and their pains, and just because of being in the presence of Jesus, they were healed. Many times Jesus would interact directly with the people, and he would say, because of your faith, you are healed. But in this case, he healed them all. Can you imagine the stories that would come out of a scenario like this? You have several thousand people, 4,000 to 5,000 people wasn't unusual. And they're looking to Jesus, and many people are touched with healing. Can you imagine the stories that come out of this? And so the multitudes of people are there. And then Jesus takes the opportunity to give them some of the basics of his kingdom. And I call it the paradoxes of the kingdom. Some of the things that today we still grapple with. They're so simple in many ways, but yet kind of complex, and we try to wrap our mind around this. And so that's what we want to do just a little bit here this morning. Luke chapter 6, verse 20. I'm reading from the New King James Version. Then he lifted up his eyes toward his disciples and said, "Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you shall be filled. Blessed are you who weep now, for you shall laugh. Blessed are you when men shall hate you, and when they exclude you, and revile you, and cast out your name as evil, for the Son of Man's sake." We could go back to Matthew 5 and find very similar wording. Some people think it was the same sermon, just different persons' notes and different perspectives. But in Matthew 5 to 7, it's certainly much longer. Luke wrote very similar stuff, just condensed it a lot more. So was it the same sermon or was it a different sermon? We don't know for sure, but it doesn't really matter. But obviously it was what Jesus taught, and more than likely he taught this more than once. Blessed and happy are you. Blessed, the term blessed is almost a direct translation to the word happy. And so we could say happy for all the times it says blessed. Blessed are you, or happy are you, for yours is the kingdom of heaven, he says about the first one. Blessed are you poor. In Matthew 5, it says poor in spirit. If we read this from a strictly, could we say from a word for word and just look at it for what it says? Blessed are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Like I said, in Matthew it says poor in spirit, so it kind of gives us maybe two different ideas or ways to look at it. But if we would look at it simply from the way it says, blessed or happy are you poor, for yours is the kingdom of heaven, it would seem like we could probably figure out who the happy people are. You know, in my mind and my logical way of thinking, well, let's figure this out. Maybe we could do it here this morning. We just line us up from the rich to the poor. And then, I'm curious how that would even come out. Maybe it would be the Laps and the Zooks and the Esches and the Stoltzfuses and the King. It would probably be all mixed up. But let's say we could line everyone up. We'd get our tax returns and we'd see who's the richest and who's the poorest. And then we would give everyone a survey. And we would figure out who is happy. Because it says, blessed are you poor. You're going to be happy, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. If we read it from that sense only, blessed are you who are hungry, for you shall be filled. So happy are you if you're hungry. Well, that doesn't quite make sense to me. I usually feel a little better after I eat. Or happy are you if you are weeping. Doesn't quite make sense. Or happy are you when you're hated. And so we have to ask the question. I was asking the question, is this referring to us in a physical sense? Or is it spiritual? We know that Jesus often spoke in parables and illustrations, and he would use earthly or physical terms to describe the spiritual. And so when I think about something that's within our physical realm, or I'm calling it the physical dimension, and if you look up that term, it would simply mean the material observable world. Something belongs to the physical dimension when it can be explained and measured within natural law. So I'm saying let's just figure out who's happy because we'll base it on rich or poor. The spiritual side of it is often this refers to non-material reality, the realm of soul, spirit, divine presence, and moral truth. It belongs to the spiritual dimension when it deals with moral truth, divine reality, or the unseen forces that shape meaning, destiny, and conscience. And so, is Jesus talking about a spiritual reality, or is he talking about a physical reality? And I would like to suggest that it's probably not an either or, but maybe some of both. And while it seems so simple, when we start breaking it down like this, it does get a little bit complicated. From a physical standpoint, we know that some of this is often the way it works itself out. I have good friends. Some of the happiest people I know are also some of the poorest people I know. And I'm thinking about friends that we made in Belize, and I could take you to some people today that had almost nothing. But yet, when I'd go to their house, and from a day-to-day perspective, they typically were, I would say pretty high on the charts of happy. And you see this play itself out. So there's a physical truth here that we can't deny. Yeah, the examples of this could go on and on. Whether it's that or whether it's hunger. Okay, let's think about hunger for just a little bit. Blessed are ye that hunger now, for ye shall be filled. Now this one's probably a little more difficult because many people, when they're suffering from hunger, it's not a good time. It's not an easy time. But if you look at it from a spiritual perspective, this one makes more sense. Because when someone is hungry, when you're wanting to learn, typically what happens, you will be filled. Some people have looked at the blessed are the poor in spirit, like it says in Matthew, as someone that's just seeking for God. And as you're seeking for God, you find what you're looking for. You find the kingdom of God. And the same could be true of this hunger. Blessed are those that are hungry for truth, that are seeking for it, and they will find it. John Lee, you work with people that are in the midst of despair. And as they seek for God, as they're hungry for truth, as they want something more, and then they find it, you can almost see that filling up of them taking place right there in the moment. And so the reality of this happening in a spiritual sense is very real. However, there's a physical side of it as well. When people are in poverty and they find Jesus, many times they work their way out of poverty. And some of the physical aspects of what they do are taken care of, including things like hunger. And so I bring out these illustrations. I don't think that it's an either or. However, we cannot just ignore either the spiritual or the physical side of it. In some ways, the statements seem to be a now and then. Like, blessed are the poor in spirit, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. So you're poor in spirit, and then in another space, another time, the kingdom of heaven will be yours. However, I don't think that's exactly the way it is either. Because some of these connections happen much more in time than that, including poor in spirit, for then the kingdom of heaven is there's something happen within your heart immediately. The kingdom of God comes into your heart immediately, and that change begins to happen immediately. The same way with hunger. While it seems like it could be something that's here and there, it also connects. So I found that fascinating. So we see these principles work out in front of our own eyes. There's probably a lot more that could be said along these lines, but you get the picture. Happy are those that seek after God. Happy are those that are hungering for Him. And then blessed or happy are even those that are being, or that are hated. In our terms, we could say there's a sense of happiness, there's a sense of fulfillment that happens when we're resisted. And that seems a little strange, but I think we can see some of this happening in real time as well. There's a sense of fulfillment in standing for truth and being resisted for it that I can't fully explain, but it tells us this very clearly right here. Blessed are ye when men shall hate you, and when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you, and cast out your name as evil for the Son of Man's sake. And in some of these cases, especially in this one, we are not necessarily the cause of what is happening. It's when others are coming against us, when others are hating us, when others are not okay with what we are doing. And in that, God desires to give us a sense of fulfillment, a sense of being blessed in His kingdom. I think that's just an amazing concept. That when we are living for Jesus, when we're living for Him, we're going to turn some people the wrong way, but God brings a sense of satisfaction into our hearts when we're doing it for Him. What an amazing principle. Most times when I'm at work and people are coming against what we're doing and they're not appreciating what we're trying to do, it doesn't feel so good. Sometimes out of a sense of righteousness, it maybe feels a little bit better. But this is what He's saying. When people come against us, we will be blessed. And I think that's amazing. But I also have seen it so many times where it's true. What an amazing principle. What an amazing God we serve. And then in verse 23, it says, rejoice in that day and leap for joy. For indeed your reward is great in heaven. For in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. And so as you see these principles work out, rejoice, leap for joy. The New Living Translation says, when that happens. Instead of for in like manner, it says, when that happens. So it's not like if it's going to happen, it's when that happens. Rejoice and leap for joy. That's amazing. For in like manner their fathers did to the prophets. It's not the first time. History is only repeating itself. Even in the Old Testament, the prophets faced some of the same things. And that's what he's pointing back to. It's nothing new. It's the way it works in God's kingdom. The next several verses are simply the inverse of the prior verses. And I'm going to spend as much time with this. I feel it kind of just is opposite. But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation. Woe to you who are full, for you shall hunger. Woe to you who laugh now, for you shall mourn and weep. Woe to you when all men speak well of you, for so did their fathers to the false prophets. Here again, we could apply some of the same ideas. If we're going to read this literally, there's a lot of wealthy people here in comparison to the rest of the world. I don't think any of you are really hungry except maybe because you didn't have breakfast and you're ready for lunch. But in the truest sense of the word, you have enough like me, I have enough of fat to live on for several weeks. You're not really hungry. So woe to you who are full, for whoa. It's just like, sorry for you because you're rich. Sorry for you because you're not hungry. Sorry for you because you don't have the capacity to mourn and to weep. Sorry for you because people are speaking good about what you do. For so did their fathers to the false prophets. So I guess in this one, we really hope this is talking about a spiritual dimension. And I really believe it does lean in that direction a lot. But sorry for you if you're not hungry for God's truth, if you're not hungry for the Word, if you haven't had a desire to get into the Word. Sorry for you. And I believe if you find ourselves there, may this be an encouragement to get on your face before the Lord and just ask for that hunger to come back. Ask for that hunger to be a part of who you are. I've already said that I think that a lot of this there's a spiritual dimension to this. And I don't just want to talk our way out of this because we live in a land of wealth and none of us are hungry physically here this morning. I do believe that we must be very careful of the eat, drink, and be merry mentality. Amos 6 verse 1 says, woe to you who are at ease in Zion and trust in Mount Samaria, notable persons in the chief nation to whom the house of Israel comes. Woe to you who are at ease, who are comfortable where you are. Luke 12:19, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And this is the story of the rich man things had gone well for him. He said, my barns aren't big enough. I'm going to tear them down. I'm going to build bigger barns. And then I'm simply going to kick back and relax. So I say again, we must be very careful. In this affluent culture, this affluent land that we live, we must be careful of, I'm calling it the eat, drink, and be merry mentality. We simply need to go look at the teaching of Jesus. Woe is you, if that is who we are. And I think this would connect very much with what Jesus was saying. So happiness or woe, hungry or full. It really doesn't seem like there's any middle ground. It's like I was just, isn't there something in between here? It doesn't seem like it. My question is, what will you face this week? As we go from here today, the potential for us to face something this week that can fit into this category of happy or woe, blessed or cursed, is so very real. Because Jesus told us, or Paul told us in Hebrews, that he said, my son, do not despise the chastening of the Lord, nor be discouraged when you're rebuked by him. For whom the Lord loves, he chastens, and scourges every son whom he receives. And that's coming from the Lord. And we also have an enemy that would so much love to get us into these categories of woe. And so what will you face this week? What will your discouragements be? Maybe you can think through that with me just a little bit. You know what's on your agenda and what's coming for you this week. So I think about our older people and widows and the widowers among us. You know that each week you may be faced with discouragement and just pity me. Maybe you're a father and in business this now, and you know that this week's going to have a lot of challenges, and you're not sure how you're going to get through it. And the list could go on and on. As mothers, you feel overwhelmed, and you just wonder how you're going to get through this week with joy. And you know there's going to be temptations that come. What will you face this week? Know that it will come. But I'd just like to close with this encouragement. Blessed is the man who endures temptation, for when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, which the Lord has promised to those who love him. Yes, there will be temptations, there will be trials. We will be tempted to be discouraged. But blessed is the man who endures temptations, who continues on. For when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life. And as we read in our passage this morning, it's not something that is only for later. It's something for even now. And God bless each of you as you consider what it is or what it means to be blessed in the Lord. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave to his disciples so many years ago. And some of it seems so upside down and so contrary to how we normally think, but when we look at it and we understand it through your lens and through the principles of how you taught and how you lived and what we see, we know it's true. And so, God, I pray that our perspective and our hearts could continually be turned towards you. Father, I pray your blessing. I pray the peace of God and the happiness that comes from knowing you could be a part of each person here this week. And Father, if there's something in our lives that is we know that the joy of the Lord is not in that I pray that you would give us the ability to bring it before you and to gain back the blessedness that you want to give to each of us. Thank you so much for the blessings, for the example that you give us here in the Word. And again, just pray your